No, that's... No! Unhand me, criminal. No! Me just... Why are you right-clicking now? You're a mouse pad. You don't have that power. Who's ready for a tier list? This is the last one I've got under my sleeves. Why do I need to look at my sleeves? I would celebrate and drink some ginger beer, but we did that at the start of the stream. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't pretty. Anyways, we have ourselves a tier list. The last one that I'm going to be making, at least until next year, to my knowledge. Which could be very wrong, as I don't think things through very well, and sometimes I get excited and come up with new ideas. If that happens, maybe we'll see another one of these. But until then, this is our last one. So, what are we looking at here? I'm sure pretty much everybody knows at this point. It's the elements. We saw in the last tier list I made, the arms. Well, that wasn't the last tier list I made. No, one of the previous ones. It just came up as a VOD. Shout out to Gaddy for making it into the VOD. Much love to him. Love. He's great. I recommend him. So, we saw the elements. We had a light discussion about them. But how do they do in, like, a competitive aspect? Like, let's look at the elements specifically. Like, we'll kind of be looking into the arms alongside. So, like, say we're looking at poison. We'll be looking at how the element works and how the arms of that element works. With more of a focus on the element, of course, as that's the important thing here. But there are balancing changes that happen with each arm based on that element. For example, shock arms always do, like, nothing for damage. They do the lowest damage and they're always built to be slow. Where firearms are meant to be fast and have high damage, plus their added effects. So we'll look at things like that, like Toaster's fast, partially because it's the fire element arm. So, starting things off here, we do have ourselves the blind effect. So, there's quite a few arms that utilize the blind effect in this game. We've got Blorb, Biffler. We have a couple of arms that utilize the blind effect. Now, these two arms are very powerful. Well, one's extremely powerful, the other's extremely situational. But what does the blind effect specifically do? Well, what it does is you get hit by a charged blind effect and the screen goes away. You can't see much. It's obstructed. There might be a Biff face or a Blorb splatter, and you can't. Do I have the mic synced up properly? That can offer up a couple of opportunities, similarly to Ice Effect, where it puts your opponent in a disadvantaged state. They don't necessarily have as well. They have their options still, but it's more difficult to wield them properly because they have to go off of the sound of what you're doing and respond appropriately. This is not always the easiest task to do, especially if you're applying some really strong pressure, going for good follow-ups. And it can give your opponent a really hard time. Overall, it is pretty strong, but it lacks a lot of oomph, primarily for the fact that while you can blind, much like in pretty much every other game where you get something like in Mario Kart with the blooper blind, your opponent usually has other avenues to be able to pay attention to the match and to respond appropriately. In this case, it would often be sound. You blind your opponent, they don't know exactly what's going on with your actions, but they know what the sound of a toaster sounds like, they know what a roaster sounds like, they know what a grab sounds like. So they just kind of have to wait there and be like, oh, hey, so I just heard a grab, which means I need to try to make sure that I punch through the grab. Oh, I just heard the zing of a roaster. I'm gonna shield. It's a cool element. It's always fun in theory. Never works out so well in practice. The arms also don't really change much based on that element. It doesn't give them any new properties. For the most part, they kind of just act like arms. I don't see too much of a difference between an unelemented arm and a blind arm. Except for a non-element arm would have more properties or more interaction with itself. So overall, we're going to probably be starting off pretty weak here. This is probably a C tier. So I haven't really quickly explained... Hang on, I'm just... That's better. So I haven't really explained what I already regret so much of this. You probably... I need a moment to calm down. What? Yeah, sure, okay. So, let me quickly explain what each of the elements, or what each tier does. I'm kind of off. I'm not... Wow, this is a really slow and long start. You know what? We're starting over. Do not... Gaddy, everything up to this point didn't happen. You know what? You're just gonna put it on there anyway, so... Probably as a takeout or something. I don't know. This probably already happens. Anyways, so... Starting over. So there is no F tier, just because I didn't feel like putting one on there. And also because of the fact that, arguably, none of the elements are completely worthless. They all have their place, they all have their time, and they all interact with the arms and make them interesting and worthwhile in their own way. S tier means it's so good. If it's something as S tier, I honestly feel like it's kind of broken in what it does, what it gives you, what it might cost is probably not much. It's just a very strong thing with a lot of benefits and extremely little detrimental effect. A tier means it's really good, but it's not perfect. There are small flaws here and there that might be able to work around. You might be able to counter it a bit more effectively, but overall, it's still a very solid element. Most of the arms that you're going to pick that are A tier are probably good picks, and they're going to work out well for you. B tier, about middle of the road. They're okay. They do well. You'll be able to find success with them. They'll give you opportunities that will benefit you in the long run, but it's not going to be as noticeable as some of the other arms that are on the, or elements on the tier list. C, if you're looking to pick an arm based on the element, this is probably not you probably not want to pick these arms. There are a couple of arms in these options that are worthwhile, but they're worthwhile because of the arm specifically, and the element has nothing to do with it. So you're probably better off ignoring those ones unless it's specifically a really good arm for other reasons. And then D tier, it's probably something you should avoid. Like, even less reasoning than the C tier, it's not good. It doesn't really do anything. Nothing's D tier, I'm gonna be honest here. Everything's kind of got some kind of decent purpose, point to it. makes it kind of worthwhile, makes it kind of competitive. Nothing really lacks that hard. We're going to move into, from here, don't forget what? So we're heading into our elements here. We're going to be looking first at the blind element. Now, what this one does is it does a blind effect. So basically, if I got hit in the face by a blorb or a biffler, I can't see anymore. You can't see the people. You can't see. It's not there. But it's not like fully blinded. Like, it would be more like this, like where I have difficulty seeing right here, but I can still see enough that I can generally work with things. You can still make out things. You can make out your surrounding. You can kind of respond to things still, but a chunk of the screen is obscured. If you're not ready for it, it's probably going to surprise you, and your opponent probably will be able to capitalize on it. That said, there are plenty of counters to blind, as all it does is obscure the camera. Your ability to move freely is completely available. You can still rush. You can still jump. You can still use charged attacks. So if your opponent isn't going for good reads or good setups, or is just too hesitant, they can blind you and it will literally do nothing. It's probably one of the most useless elements in this game. It's good for mix-ups. It's good for when you're really pressuring your opponent and scaring them. But for the most part, you're probably not going to find too many good opportunities to make it work. It's going to be our C tier. Start you off weak. It's not very powerful. You're probably going to have a better time with pretty much any other element if you're looking to equip a tool specifically for its element. On that note, we're going to move over to something that's fairly decent, but I definitely say overall is a lot more situational than a lot of people might think. Especially since there is another element that arguably does what it does, but just better. And this element that we're talking about is the electric arm, or the stun arm as I like to call it. Now, the stun element has quite a few arms to it: the Megawatt, the Sparky, the Seeky, the Parabola, and the Guardian. And I think that's all. Revolver. I totally remembered one of my default arms from the character I made. And Thunderbird. I remember. Don't have like cheat sheet over there. You can't see it. It's not there. So what does the shock element do? It's a free and easy way to disable both your opponent's arms. They get knocked down, they just kind of sit there drooping, and they have an intense amount of limited maneuverability. They can't shield, they can't rush, they're just basically stationary with very light movement. Now, the duration of this stun depends on the arm, with Guardian being the longest, Seeky being next, then pretty much all the others are about the same duration for their stun. I think maybe something is slightly less, but overall, once you've gone below the Seeky, they're all basically the same time frame. You need to be moderately close, like mid to close range, to make anything that isn't a Guardian or a Seeky work. Guardian and Seeky are designed for you to be able to stun and grab your opponent or punish them from mid to max range, but even then, sometimes that doesn't always work out depending on what you have alongside those arms. Now, you can disable your opponent's arms. It can do things like get rid of Brass's buff, Min Min's dragon arm. It's generally pretty useful, but it is completely ineffective if your opponent is suspended in the air. As you don't get that stun, they immediately get knocked down, and you only get the detriments to what a stun arm generally has. What are the detriments generally? Well, stun element arms are some of the slowest in this game. They tend to do the lowest amount of damage across the board, Megawatt being the one exception to this rule. And even then, its counterpart is designed to just straight up do a lot more damage. Megawatt's probably the only arm of the stun elements that I would consider competitive. You can use the others in a lot of setups, a lot of plays, but you're probably putting yourself... You're probably better off picking, like if you went with Guardian, you're probably better off picking its alternative, the Clapback. If you went the Seeky, you're generally better off picking the Homie in a lot of exchanges, just because of that, all that chip damage, all that rush is so much stronger. Sparky is the worst glove by far, and that is entirely because it's shock element. It's still good, can still work really well, but if you're just looking to have some good success, you're probably going to do a lot better if you just switched over to the Toaster. So, overall, it's a good arm. It struggles a lot, though. And especially when you're considering the fact that there is a element that basically does what it does, but better. Yes. I would be hard-pressed to pick this element in most cases. It's another one that... Between one and another, it's probably best avoided. There's usually too many detrimental effects. Oh, right. Thunderbird. Thunderbird's also one of the two stun element or shock arms that would actually kind of make it into the competitive scene. Though Thunderbird is, I'd say, is a lot more situational and is not always the most consistent choice. Our next element is going to be a lot more rewarding, a lot more powerful, and a lot more oppressive. Blast element. Now, this is probably one of the strongest elements in this game based on the fact that all of the arms that do have this element have high damage output. Uncharged, they're alright, but when you have something like the Nade, the Lockjaw, the Tri-Blast, you're getting at minimum about 130 damage on a charged hit. Their rushes have, if they're a finishing touch, that final hit is going to be the most damage you can get in this game. Shock element has probably around the bottom, where Blast will have the exact opposite. Like, if you go in with the Sparky and the Nade, and you're going Flurry Rush, you want to finish with the Nade, because that's going to do, like, an additional 80 to 100 damage on your rush, like, overall. If you just finish with the Nade. Consistently does more damage. They're a mix between slow to medium speed. They're definitely not the fastest things, but they're not the slowest things. Like, they're about middle ground in terms of speed. One of the big things about explosion arms, or explosive ones, is they also tend to have a lot of control for the user. They're high risk, but there's a lot of reward to it. You get that curve, you get a lot of really good angles that some of the other arms just can't do. Nade being the single best glove for curving your aim, lining things up. Lockjaw, you just get 2 bullets. You get 2 bullets, you line up. A lot of the explosions just have a lot of freedom, and they also get around deflects, or a lot of shields. It's a second effect. It's a second hit, which means that it's more difficult for your opponent to time, and it can actually lead to confirms for you to follow up with a rush or a grab or just an additional attack. They're not as strong in the air, but you still get a bit of extra damage, and it usually works out pretty well. There is one big caveat to explosive arms, and that is the fact that beyond slight exceptions to the rule like Lockjaw, if you have an explosive arm charged up and you have yet to throw it, and your opponent does arm damage to that charged arm, it will self-explode on you, and it will generally just do a light amount of damage, might knock you back depending on how you're moving or what you're taking at that time, can give your opponent confirms into you, and depending on what kind of arm it is, say the Seeky for example, it can have even more detrimental effects where you're mixing between the stun and the explosion, results in you just stunning yourself and your opponent just gets to follow up, easy combos, strong punishes. So this explosion arms are some of the strongest, but they require some of the more advanced levels of play. If you want to use an explosive arm correctly, you're going to need to be fairly experienced in this game competitively, know really what you're doing, how to work with things, to get that, to just get everything you want out of it. Because of that self-explosion, that cost, it's definitely not an S tier, but it's about as close to an S tier as you could get for an arm like that. Generally, you're gonna have a good time working with it. Another element that you're gonna have a good time working with, also the bread and butter of pretty much every player's loadout, is the fire element. So, to quickly cover what the fire element does, is it's an instant knockdown. So it's going to be a lot more difficult to get confirmed follow-ups off of it. But you get a huge burst of damage, you knock them down immediately, and you also get to drain away a little bit of your opponent's rush. Which means that if you're pressuring, if you're advantaged and you're just wailing on them with fire elemented arms, they don't have an answer because you're taking away their only other option, which is, while they're getting pelted down, oh, now I've got my rush, I have a chance to push back. Fire element takes that away, which means that they have to be able to know how to play on wake up. They need to be able to get up, defend from your attack, which could be a grab, a charged attack, a rush setup, it could be anything. They have to know how to respond to that, and then punish you, and then break out of that. That is not an easy thing to do, especially against heavy characters or characters like Min Min when they've got that dragon arm ready. It is just a hard time. Fire type arms are some of the fastest, not necessarily the fastest to retract, but generally they're pretty consistent, pretty steady. They are the tried and true element of this game. It's been a fire elemented arms were an extremely strong pick from Arms' inception, and it continues to be a very prominent and consistent choice to this day. This is a great element for beginners and a great element for masters, and is probably going to be the best element out of all of them, just consistently. You will have, while it's not personally an element I like to use in a lot of my loadouts, I would be a fool to say that the fire element is not the strongest element in this game. Just by far. It's a little trickier, you can still get rush confirms. That instant knockdown means a lot in a lot of exchanges. You get higher damage with things like Toaster and Roaster. There rarely are there costs to utilizing a firearm. There is one element that beats it in certain circumstances, but just in its overall consistency, it's not as strong as the fire element. And we'll get to that one in a little bit. So our next element is going to be the ice element. Now, for a while, this was a pretty high tier element. It was generally seen as one of the strongest. To quickly explain what the ice element does, you hit your opponent with an ice attack. Say you shot an ice dragon beam, you hit with a cool rain, and that's going to immediately freeze your opponent in their tracks. Their arms get uncharged. If they have any buff state like Brass or Min Min, they lose that, and they're just motionless on the ground. They do have light movement, much akin to being stunned by the shock element. They do have the full ability to be able to punch and shield though, but the reason why ice is really strong is because not only does it make it really difficult for your opponent to adjust their camera, but it also means that it actually lasts for quite a while, like 3-4 seconds, I think 5 seconds, where you're just completely frozen. That's a lot of time for you to be able to pressure and just get some extra damage. While this isn't the element I was specifically talking about, ice and the freeze element is probably just like, in most cases, it's riskier, but it's a more rewarding shock. It works better, you get better setups, it's a lot faster. Like, by far, it is so much faster than any shock element arm. It does really struggle with rush damage, depending on the element or the arm you grab. Chilla has very little output, but if you throw on something like a Cooler Rain Ice Dragon, you're probably going to be able to pull out a lot of damage during getting that ice chain. Chill is the easiest to get the chains, but everything else kind of does it well enough if you know what you're doing. To quickly explain an ice chain is you just keep... So your opponent's in that disadvantaged state. You can knock them down, or if you're pacing your charged ice hits and keep refreshing it, your opponent just stays in this really disadvantaged state, and if you keep hitting them, their health pool is just going to quickly deplete, and you're just going to get an immense amount of damage off of it. You'll quickly charge up Rush, and you'll just put yourself in an even stronger position. The Ice Element's definitely a very solid one. Unfortunately, as I was saying, while your opponent is in a disadvantaged state, they still have options. And if they're on top of things, if they're not getting red hard, or if they're just making sure they're getting the right reads, they can actually kind of punch back against your freeze, and it can turn against you in certain cases. If they have a rush ready, they can just pop that out at any moment that they need, and that breaks the ice effect, free to move again, and they could, if they're ready, they could just dive in and punish you. But that also means that you can bait out the rush a little more effectively. It's a little more of a dance of an element. It's not necessarily a very strong one, but it's really prominent. It's really effective. When you see it, you do have to be careful, but with practice, it can be one of the elements that aren't going to be as effective as Scary. Overall, it's a B tier. It's good in a lot of cases. The arms that it has generally are pretty strong. Everything works well with the ice element, but there are going to be worlds where using the ice elemented arms is going to kind of just do like nothing. Speaking of nothing, that's our next element. No element. This goes to very special arms like the Megaton, like the Buff and Bub. You don't see it too often. Well, no, you actually see it fairly often here and there. Buff and Bub are very, very prominent gloves, along with every other glove. So, no element means that there is no element. Like, there's just a straight up black. I just realized that the Snake Park tournament was supposed to start 7 minutes ago. There's one person who entered. LaFleur. Cool. Hi, LaFleur. Thanks for entering. We can play on the Snake Park in a minute. So it doesn't really do it. It doesn't have any primary effect. It doesn't burn your opponent when charged. It's basically an uncharged arm. So what do they do to kind of balance that out? Well, there's a couple of things. It really depends on the arm. Megaton, for example, has an absurdly high amount of damage when it's charged. You go in, you do a boop, and it goes from 110 to 140. It also increases in size, making it much easier to block attacks, and I think the speed is about the same. Generally, it's just good. Buff and Bub, they basically like double in size. Like they go from this to like this. Or no, like this, and then you just throw on another fist. That's the buff now when it's charged. Now imagine that on Min Min with that as her dragon arm, and it turns this into like just like my head. My head becomes a fist, quite basically, and then you just punch them with my head, and it's so big and obtrusive that there's nothing that you can really do. It can be really difficult to fight off. So this one, technically it should be a low tier, but to offset the fact that it is not doing anything, the arms that have it are generally improved in incredible ways. Clapback is probably the most prominent example of this, where it's literally a shield that reflects. It's the mirror shield. It's one of the strongest arms in this game, and it lacks any element. So while it does have a lot of those nice bonuses, a lot of those nice encouragements, I still wouldn't say it's too great. It's strong, but it doesn't hold up as well as a lot of the other elements. It's good. It's got its place. It makes things work, but there's a lot of other choices that you're probably gonna... If you're going for it, you're looking for a very specific thing. And if you're not looking for that specific thing, it's another case of you probably have a better choice. If you're looking at buff or bub, there's a lot of cases where sometimes Toaster's probably just going to be a better pick for you. Heading into our next element, we've got ourselves the poison. Now, this was an element that was introduced with Masango, and it's kind of lived with Masango. Not necessarily in terms of competitive sense, but when Masango was revealed and added into the character pool, he was given 3 arms: Scully, Scorpid, and Glusher. All of them poison elemented arms. All of them the only poison elemented arms. There is not a single other arm in this game that has the poison element. Now, what does it do specifically? Well, if you've had experiences in Pokemon, Final Fantasy, literally anywhere that's a video game, you probably can figure out what the poison does. It's a slow damage over time that will sap away your opponent's health. It only lasts for a few moments, about 5 to 10 seconds. I can't remember the exact number, but it's around that range. And it ticks for 1 point of damage every brief moment. It caps off at 12 damage, so basically any poison elemented arm, if you connect with the charge, it's, from what it had, it does another 12. So Scully charged hit does 90, so technically it's 102. But there's a little bit more to it. Whenever that poison tick stacks, or happens, the opponent or the player poisoned stutters. It's generally only for like a frame, a very brief moment. You can barely notice it sometimes, but it can slow down an opponent's movement, leave them exposed enough that you might be able to set up another hit with the charged poison, or just any other follow-up or combos. It's kind of like a freeze light, but with damage. And on top of that damage, if you hit them with a second hit of a charged poison attack while they're already poisoned, it upgrades. So 1 damage turns into 2 damage. The stutter becomes just slightly more noticeable. If you hit them a 3rd time, it turns into 3 stacks and even more noticeable with that stutter, and caps off at 36 damage before expiring. You can refresh that 3rd stack from then on, and it will just consistently be a 3 damage tick over and over and over. Your opponent will have a lot more awkward movement, which means you can get better punishes, better setups. So it is kind of like a freeze arm, but trading a lot of the restricting your opponent's movement for damage. And it's not much damage, but when used right, it turns out to actually be a lot of damage. The rushes are also pretty powerful. They do a decent amount. Actually, quite a lot. They generally do a lot of damage. There's always the finishing touch too. If the final hit is with a poison arm, that gets the poison stack on, which means you get an additional 12 damage. This poison stack cannot KO. So if you get a hit, if you've got 3 stacks and you just sit there and watch like the last 30 of their health take away, they will be left at the magic pixel no matter what. It's a great art. It's a great element. The arms are pretty good. They're a little more situational overall, but that's also just the cost of having like such a small pool, a small selection. There's not really any too steady, too serious of poison arms beyond the Scully. But when you can make it can work really well. I'm going to put it right behind the non-element, as it kind of plays like the non-element, but in a different way, different style. It's a slightly less effective ice, and it's a mixture of ice and no element, basically, where it kind of has the two. It has some interesting setup, some really unique balance. It's really cool. I really like it, but it is lacking in a lot of cases, especially in arm selection. What isn't lacking in arm selection, though, is our next element, which is the stun, or what I generally call flinch, because I call the shock stun. Therefore, it makes sense to call the one that's actually stun flinch, because it makes more sense. Because when you hit the opponent, they're not stunned, they're flinching for an extended time. Basically doubles the duration for how long an opponent flinches. Which means that, like, when you hit with an uncharged hit, your opponent, you'll notice your opponent will do like a and then they're back in control. If you hit them with a flinch arm, that it doubles it goes like and that also happens in the air too. So if you hit them, normally it's like oh, but if you hit them in the air, they're like oh, and then they fall on the ground, which means that you can get some good setups, you can get some good plays. A lot of the flinch arms are generally pretty solid. Some more situational than others, but flinch arms generally have a surprisingly high damage output. The rush usually isn't too strong to accommodate for the fact that if you get a good flinch, you're probably going to be able to follow up with rush, which means that technically it's the rush damage plus the initial flinch. So like about a 280 damage rush with double tribal, plus the 120 you got from the initial charged hit to follow it up. So you get about a 400 damage rush, which balances out with some of the other ones where you have to be a lot more blind or open to going in with it. While they are pretty strong, there are a lot of offsets to the stun arm. I didn't bring this up again about non-element or poison, but or ice, or explosion, or blind. But armor fighters, like Mechanica, like Master Mummy, like Brass when he's buffed up, they actually don't take any knockback or serious detriment to a lot of these arms. It can mess with them, it can stutter them, cause them some freezes, but overall, they're going to continue fighting you and will not get knocked down. Unless they are not utilizing their armor at the moment. Which means that you're probably going to struggle a lot more against them with these arms. But at the same time, if you know how to play with a good flinch arm, if you know how to use a flinch arm like a tribal really well against an armored opponent, actually can kind of turn things around. One of my personal favorite loadouts against heavy characters, especially Master Mummy, is going in with Nade Whammer. While you don't get any knockdown on Master Mummy, all the chip damage, all the flinch from the Whammer, it kind of just locks them into a state where some players will only feel that they have the option to shield and wait, which means that you get grabs, and you just get a lot of nice pressure, you just get really safe options, and you will quickly burn through their health, faster than they'd probably expect. Overall, flinch arms, really solid, probably some of the best in this game. It is the superior element to like the combo arms, which would be flinch, freeze, and shock. It's by far the best of the three. If you're trying to pick between the three and what you're kind of looking for, it kind of does what it's the opposite of poison, where poison is a marriage of two but doesn't work out as well. This is a marriage of the two but works out just better. You get pretty much the main rewards you're looking for from both in a much more easily accessible way. To finish off this tier list, we've got my personal favorite element and a very strong and just effective element. Probably in most cases, like, if it had better arms, it would be easily the best element in this game. And that's the wind element. So, wind element has a lot going for it. The arms are generally very fast, because it's wind. Wind goes fast! Haha, it's a joke that they were like, it lines up, it's cool, funny, yeah! Wind elements also tend to do a decent amount of damage. I think the lowest being 110, and that's Slamamander. Oh, and Boomerang. Okay, no, so they do about sub-decent damage. It's decent enough damage to make an impact, but not like awesome damage like a Roaster. Usually these arms are good at countering things, which means that you can work around an opponent's playstyle and punish them pretty hard with it. And then the biggest reason why Wind Element is so strong is the fact that when you hit with a charged Wind Element, rather than an increased flinch, rather than them being frozen, rather than them being stunned, it is an extended knockback instead. So, you know that animation of the opponent falling? It kind of extends that by lifting them high into the air and then having them slowly fall to the ground. Now, normally this might not sound like a very rewarding thing, but there's a lot you can do with that. First off, that means that you have now gained neutral, because your opponent was blown back a distance, they are lifted into the ground, they fly backwards, and to the left or right, depending on which way you hit from. Which means that you just, rather than the knockback where they lose some ground and then they get up, they fly for a while, which means you can just chase after them, and now they're probably backed into a corner even if they had, like, full neutral. They just lose all of it because of that element. Some other things you can do, you can also juggle off of that first hit, so while they're slow falling back to the ground, go for another punch, and that immediately increases the damage of any wind element arm by 20. So Popper now does 140 damage, Boomerang does 130, Slamamander does 130 as well. You can also follow up with a rush if you get your timing down and recognize the right opportunity. Popper is one of the easiest to do this with, as you can basically follow up a charged Popper connection with a Popper rush. And, like, you don't even need another arm to do that. You hit with a charged Popper, you throw a rush, and then you throw that same Popper, and it'll probably connect, and then you could just have whatever else to complement it. Say a Lockjaw for increased rush damage. And then the more interesting thing that you can do with the wind element, you can kind of do this with the ice too, but this is most noticeable with wind is because of that extended knockback, because it takes them so long to get back up, it's a really easy opportunity for you to not only gain neutral, but gain buffs like Min Min's Dragon Arm, Brass's buff mode, and the big one, Springtron's EMP. This is probably the strongest element specifically on Springtron, with the second being that ice element, because of the fact that when you get a knockback with the wind element, it's one of the few cases you actually just get a safe opportunity to EMP a Springtron and buff yourself up so you've got higher movement speed, permanent charges, and yeah, just those two. Like, you just move really fast and you've got perma charge for like 10 seconds. And you get all that just by hitting a wind element. There's no other arm that you can knock your opponent down and then, like Brass or Min Min, quickly charge up and then continue pressuring. Like, those two, if they land with a Toaster, if they land with a Chilla, if they land with a Sparky, they go for a grab. If they just do a double punch on you and you fall down, then they get a buff up. Springtron, if he does any of that and then tries to EMP, they get up and they grab you and you lose. But if you hit with the wind element, then you get that EMP, provided you space right, and you have EMP now. The rushes are generally pretty strong as well. It is really good. It's a really strong element. It does some really cool things. Unfortunately, it has one offset. It doesn't have as many options as the fire element. It doesn't have Toaster. It doesn't have Roaster. It doesn't have the Phoenix. It doesn't have Hydra. It beats the Cracker, which basically obsoletes the Cracker, but that's about it. There's a competition between Slap and Slamamander. That that one's a little more mixed. Overall, I'd definitely say Slamamander's better than the Slap, but that's a case of, like, the Slap is slightly more consistent. But, like, you just have good arms on the Fire Element. Like, the bonus is good. Everything just lines up so well and works so perfectly. Where at Wind Element, all of its arms are generally a little more awkward, a little more tricky to use. They're extremely rewarding, but they take that little bit of finesse to really make them shine. And with that, we're going to finish things up by putting it as the second S tier arm. And with that, that does end the tier list. At least our final one. Fire, Wind, two of the best elements. Explosive being one of the best by far as well. Except for the fact that you can blow yourself up and it sucks. Flinch, then freeze, then lack, poison, stun, then blind. So overall, they are all good elements. If you know how to use them, how to line them up, and how to deploy them, they can all work. But some of them work out just a little bit better. Maybe, yeah. Maybe this will be the last one. We'll see if another one comes up. I can't guarantee it. Or, I wouldn't expect a new one to come up. Because I think I've ran out of all my ideas for tier lists. I mean, I could start doing, like, meme stuff and, like, make a tier list for characters and their skin palettes or skin colors, I guess, or like how characters walk. I don't know. Anything that I make a tier list for arms from here on, there's a high chance it would be memes. Until like next year when I can do like a look back on the previous arms tier list and then kind of continue from there. But yeah, that's about it. Thank you all for watching. For those watching the VOD on YouTube, there's the subscribe is somewhere down that way. You can hit it if you'd like, or don't. I mean, this channel's, while I am creating content for it, it is mostly more just an archive of whatever happens on the stream. Which means you should watch the Twitch channel and watch my streams instead. I run weekly tournaments. They're fun! Sometimes. And, yeah, other stuff. There are links in description. Gaddy is cool. Okay. And that's the end of that. Gaddy, cut it. Put it on press. We're done.